Hey, my name is Gabriel Reyes. I'm 33 years old, and I live at the end of a gravel road outside Bozeman, Montana, in a house I built with my own two hands and never expected to share with anyone. I work as a heavy equipment operator for a road crew, which means I spend most of my life sitting in a cab with a diesel engine humming under me and a radio that only picks up two stations, both of them country. My hands are rough. My back hurts most mornings. I don't talk much, and the people I work with have stopped trying to get me to. That's fine. I stopped trying to get myself to a long time ago. But on a Tuesday night in early November, I came out of my house at 10 minutes past 9 to grab a wrench out of my truck, and there was a piece of paper folded under the windshield wiper. It had been raining earlier, so the paper was soft at the edges, going translucent where the water had gotten to it. I unfolded it under the porch light. The handwriting was small and careful, like someone had tried very hard to make it neat and hadn't quite been able to hold the pen steady. It said, "If the lights go out in my house tonight, call the police. Please don't knock. Don't come over, just call." That was all. No name. No signature. Nothing. I stood in my own driveway in the cold with that piece of paper in my hand and felt something in my chest go very still. I looked across the field at the only other house on this road, the Whitaker place, 200 yards through wet grass. A low light burning in the kitchen window, the shape of a woman moving behind the curtain. I had lived on this road for 6 years, and in 6 years I had said maybe 40 words to her. But let me take you back, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what kind of man I was before that night, and what kind of quiet I had built for myself, and why it took a note under a windshield wiper to break it. 6 years ago, I bought 40 acres and a half-collapsed farmhouse from a bank that was in a hurry to be rid of it. I bought it because I had just come out of the worst year of my life, and I wanted to be somewhere no one could reach me. My mother had died in March of that year, slow and hard, in a hospital room in Billings, and I had been the only one there for it. My father had been gone since I was 11. I had no brothers, no sisters, and a girlfriend named Cassie, who packed her things 3 weeks after the funeral and told me, standing in the doorway with a box on her hip, that she couldn't spend the rest of her life waiting for me to say something. I didn't argue with her. That was the whole problem, and we both knew it. So I bought the farmhouse and I rebuilt it. I tore out the rotten floor joists and laid new ones. I re-roofed it in October with my hands so cold I couldn't feel the nails. I rewired it, replumbed it, hung the drywall, sanded the floors, and when it was done, 2 years later, I had a house that was warm and dry and completely perfectly silent. That was the point. I wanted a place where nothing was expected of me, where I didn't have to be anything for anybody. And for 4 years, that's exactly what I got. Then, on a morning in July, a moving truck came down my road and stopped at the Whitaker place. I was on my porch drinking coffee. I watched a man in a golf shirt direct 2 movers with the kind of impatience that made me set my mug down. I watched a woman get out of the passenger side of a black SUV, and I watched the way she stood there in the driveway with her arms crossed over her chest, looking at the house like it was a sentence she'd been handed. Her name was Nora. I learned that a week later when she came over to ask if the well water was safe to drink. She was maybe 30, with dark hair she kept pushed back behind her ears and a way of standing that took up as little room as possible. She had a bruise on her forearm that she noticed me not looking at, and she pulled her sleeve down over it in one smooth motion, like she'd done it 1,000 times. "It's fine," I told her about the water. "Been drinking it 6 years. She nodded and said thank you and turned to go. And then she stopped and said, without turning back around, "You've got a nice porch." And then she walked home across the field. That was the longest conversation we had in the next 2 years. I want to be honest with you about something. I saw things. I saw the way her husband's truck came down the road too fast at night. I heard, on still evenings, the sound of a voice raised inside a house 200 yards away, and I knew that a voice has to be very loud indeed to carry 200 yards through a closed window. I saw her once at the feed store in town, and when I said hello, she went white, not embarrassed. White, and looked past my shoulder to where her husband was paying at the counter, and she said, "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met," and turned away. And I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself that a man who minds his own business is a man who doesn't cause harm. I told myself a lot of things over those 2 years, and every single one of them was a way of saying, I don't want to be responsible for another person's life. Not again. Not after my mother. And then a piece of paper appeared under my windshield wiper, and every one of those things I'd told myself turned out to be worth exactly nothing. I read the note 4 times standing in the driveway. Then I went inside and sat at my kitchen table and read it a 5th time under a better light. If the lights go out in my house tonight, call the police. Please don't knock. Don't come over. Just call. I turned it over. The back was blank. I thought about the phrasing. Please don't knock. She had thought about that part. She had considered the possibility of me coming over, and she had specifically, deliberately asked me not to, which meant that in her mind, me showing up at her door made things worse, not better, which meant that whatever was happening in that house, my presence in it was a trigger, not a rescue. That understanding sat in my stomach like a swallowed stone. I got up and turned off my kitchen light so she wouldn't be able to see me watching, and I sat down by the front window with my phone in my hand. And I looked across the dark field at the yellow square of her kitchen window, and I waited. Here's what I want you to understand about waiting. It is the loneliest work there is. You cannot do anything. You cannot solve anything. You can only sit in the dark and watch a light and hope that it stays on. At 9:40, a shadow crossed the window. At 9:55, the kitchen light went out, and my heart came up into my throat. And then a light came on upstairs, and I realized she'd just gone up to bed, and I put my head in my hands and breathed like a man who'd been held underwater. At 10:30, the truck came down the road. I heard it before I saw it. It came fast, gravel spitting up under the tires, and it swung into the Whitaker driveway hard enough that the headlights swept across my own front porch. A man got out. Even from 200 yards, I could tell how he was moving. There's a way a man walks when he's already decided something, and it isn't a walk. It's more like the front of him is arriving before the rest of him is ready. He went inside. The upstairs light stayed on. I sat there with my phone in my hand and my thumb over the 9. 11 o'clock. 11:15. The upstairs light was still on. I remember thinking very clearly, if I call now and nothing is happening, I have humiliated a woman who trusted me enough to leave a note on my truck. If I don't call and something is happening, I will have to live with that. And then, at 11:22, the upstairs light went out. Not the way a light goes out when someone turns it off. There's a difference. And I've thought about this for a long time since, and I still can't explain how I knew. Except that a light that's turned off goes out cleanly, and a light that goes out because something struck the switch, or something struck the wall, or something struck the lamp, that light flickers first. It flickered. Then it was black. Every window in that house was black. I was already on my feet. I called 911 and I heard my own voice say the address like it belonged to someone else. And the dispatcher was calm, and she asked me questions I answered without knowing what I was saying. And the whole time I was standing at my own front door with my boots on and my hand on the knob, and every muscle in my body was screaming at me to run across that field. Please don't knock. Don't come over, just call. I have never in my life done anything harder than staying in that doorway. The deputies took 19 minutes. I know that because I watched every one of them go by on the clock above my stove. I stood on my porch and I watched 2 sets of headlights come down my gravel road and turn into that driveway. And I watched flashlight beams cross the dark windows, and I watched the front door open, and I watched a woman come out onto the step in a sweatshirt with her arms wrapped around herself, and even from 200 yards, even in the dark, I could see that she was standing. She was standing. I don't think I've ever been more grateful for a thing in my life than I was for the sight of a woman standing up. They took him out about 40 minutes later. I didn't watch that part. I went inside and I sat down on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and I shook so hard my teeth knocked together. And I couldn't have told you at that moment whether it was relief or fear or the 2 years of pretending it wasn't my business finally coming due all at once. Around 1 in the morning, there was a knock on my door. It was a sheriff's deputy, a young guy with a notepad, and behind him, standing at the bottom of my porch steps with a blanket around her shoulders, was Nora. She wouldn't come up. She stood in the wet grass in the cold and looked up at me, and her face was the face of someone who has been holding something for so long that she has forgotten what her hands feel like empty. The deputy asked me questions. When did I find the note? Did I still have it? Had I seen or heard anything prior? I answered him. I gave him the note. And when he was done and turned to walk back to his cruiser, Nora stayed. She stood there in the grass. I came down the steps because I didn't know what else to do, and I stopped about 6 feet from her because I remembered that she had asked me not to come close, and I wasn't going to be another man who ignored that. She looked at the ground for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "You called?" "Yeah." "I wasn't sure you would." She said it without accusation. She said it like a woman confirming a fact she'd already accepted. And that, not the note, not the light going out, not the 19 minutes, that was the thing that broke something open in my chest. Because what she was telling me, in the plainest way she knew how, was that she had gone out into her own driveway on a rainy night and put a piece of paper on a stranger's truck, and then gone back inside and gotten into bed next to a man she was afraid of, fully prepared for nobody to come. "Why me?" I asked her. She looked up, and she said, "Because you're the only one who never asked me if I was okay." I didn't understand at first. I opened my mouth to say something and closed it again. She saw the confusion, and she almost smiled, and it was the saddest thing I'd ever seen on a human face. "Everybody asks," she said. "The woman at the pharmacy asks. My sister asks. And every single one of them asks in front of him, or where he can find out they asked. And then they go home and feel good about themselves, and I'm the one who pays for it." She pulled the blanket tighter. "You never asked. You just looked at me like you knew and you kept your mouth shut. That's the only reason I'm alive right now." I stood in the wet grass in the dark and I couldn't say a word. I had spent 2 years telling myself that my silence was cowardice. And here she was telling me it was the only thing that had kept her safe. Both of those things were true. I've had a long time to think about it since, and I still can't make them cancel each other out. That night she slept in her sister's car, driven up from Livingston at 2 in the morning, and I stood on my porch and watched the taillights go until they turned onto the county road and disappeared. And then I went inside and didn't sleep at all. I want to tell you what happened next, but I have to tell you first that it didn't happen fast. There's a version of this story where the police come, and the bad man goes away, and the next morning the sun comes up on a clean world. That is not what happened. What happened was months. What happened was that he was arrested, and then he was released. And there was a protective order, and the protective order was a piece of paper. And I learned very quickly that a piece of paper does not stop a truck from coming down a gravel road at 11 o'clock at night. He came back 3 times that first month. Not to the house. She wasn't in the house. She was at her sister's in Livingston, and the house sat empty and dark, with a realtor's sign in the front yard that nobody was calling about. He came to look at it. He'd park on the road with his headlights on the front door and sit there. And I'd sit in my own dark kitchen and watch him sit there. The second time, I called the sheriff. The third time, I walked out to the end of my driveway with a flashlight in my hand and stood there and let him see me. He rolled his window down. He was maybe 40, good-looking in a way that had gone soft at the edges. And he looked at me with an expression of genuine, almost wounded confusion, and he said, "You're the one that called." "Yeah." "You don't even know her." And I remember thinking that he actually believed that was an argument, that the correct amount of connection required to pick up a phone was somewhere above 0, and he was calling me out for not having it. I said, "Go home, Mr. Whitaker." And he sat there for a second, and then he laughed, and he said something I have not forgotten, and I don't think I ever will. He said, "You think you did something good. You just made her homeless." Then he rolled the window up, and he drove away. And I stood at the end of my driveway with my flashlight pointed at nothing and felt the whole thing collapse inward. Because he wasn't entirely wrong. That was the worst part. He wasn't entirely wrong. She had lost the house. She had lost the job at the clinic in town because she couldn't drive 40 minutes each way from Livingston, and her sister's car was needed elsewhere. She had lost, as far as I could tell, the entire architecture of her daily life, and the thing that had knocked it down was a phone call I made from my kitchen. I didn't sleep well that winter. But here is the thing about doing what's right. It doesn't feel like anything at first. It doesn't feel good. It feels like standing in the wreckage of something and being told you're the one who lit the match. It only starts to look like the right thing much, much later, from very far away, and only if you're willing to keep standing there long enough to see it. In February, she came back. I was under my truck in the driveway with a socket wrench and a lot of profanity, when I heard tires on the gravel and slid out to find an old blue Corolla and Nora getting out of it with her hair pulled back and a look on her face like she'd rehearsed something in the car and was already losing her grip on it. She'd cut her hair. That was the first thing I noticed. It was short now, just past her ears, and she kept touching it like she wasn't used to it yet. "Hi," she said. "Hi, She stopped. Started over. "I got a job. At the hardware store on Main. It's not much, but it's a job." I stood up and wiped my hands on a rag, and I found that I couldn't say anything at all. She kept going, faster now, like she had to get it all out before she lost her nerve. And I found a place. It's a room above the store. The guy who owns it rents it out. It's small, but it's mine. And I signed the lease myself with my own name, and nobody else's name is on it. Her voice cracked on that last part, and she stopped and looked at the sky and breathed. "Sorry. Don't. I've been driving out here for 3 weeks," she said. I get to the turnoff, and I turn around and go home. "Today I didn't turn around." I put the rag down. "Why?" And she looked at me with those dark eyes, and she said, "Because I wanted to say thank you, and I couldn't figure out how to do it without also saying I'm sorry. And I didn't want to say I'm sorry because I'm not. And it took me 3 weeks to be okay with that." I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything anyone has ever said to me. She wasn't sorry. She had lost her house and her job and 2 years of her life, and she was not sorry. And she had driven 20 miles 3 weeks in a row to make sure I understood that. I asked her if she wanted coffee. She said yes. That was the beginning. I'm not going to pretend it was simple after that because it wasn't, and I don't want to lie to you about how these things work. The first time I made her a cup of coffee, she stood in my kitchen and didn't sit down for 20 minutes because she was mapping the exits. She did it without knowing she was doing it. I watched her eyes go to the back door, the window, the hallway. I didn't say anything about it. I just kept my hands where she could see them, and I stayed on my side of the table. The first time I raised my voice, I dropped a piece of pipe on my foot in the barn and swore loud enough to startle a crow off the fence. She went so still and so quiet that I had to walk outside and stand in the cold for 5 minutes before I could come back in and speak. And when I did, I said, "That wasn't at you." And she said, "I know." And then after a second, "My body doesn't know yet." That's what it was like. Her mind knew things her body hadn't caught up to. So we went slow. We went so slow that I don't think either of us would have called it anything at all for the first 4 months. She came out on Sundays. She'd help me split wood, badly at first and then not badly. And we'd talk about nothing. About the store. About a customer who bought 40 feet of chain and wouldn't say what for. About whether the elk were going to come down into the low pasture this year. She never talked about him. I never asked. And I want to say something about that because I think it matters. There's a version of a man who would have needed to know, who would have needed the details, would have needed to hear the whole story so he could file it away and feel appropriately outraged and appropriately heroic. I decided very early that I wasn't going to be that man. If she wanted to tell me, she'd tell me. What she needed from me wasn't my outrage. It was Sundays. In June, we were sitting on my porch steps at the end of a long day, and the light was doing that thing it does out here in the summer. Going gold and then going pink, and she said, out of nowhere, "I left the note 4 times. I turned to look at her. "What?" "Before the night you found it." She was looking at the field, not at me. I wrote it 4 times over about 6 months, and 3 of those times I walked halfway across that field and then turned around and went back and burned it in the sink. She turned her hands over in her lap and looked at them. The 4th time it was raining and I couldn't feel my fingers, and I put it on the truck and I ran. I didn't say anything. She said, "I want you to know that I almost didn't." And I said, "I know." And she said, "How?" And I said the truest thing I had, because I almost didn't call. She looked at me then. And I told her about the 19 minutes. I told her about standing in my doorway with my hand on the knob. I told her that I had spent 2 years hearing a voice carry across a field and telling myself it was none of my business, and that if that light hadn't flickered, if it had just gone out clean, I don't know that I would have picked up the phone at all. I told her that I was not a good man who did a brave thing. I was a coward who got one chance and barely took it. She listened to all of it without moving. And when I was done, she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "Gabriel." It was the first time she'd used my name. "You called." That's all, just that. She didn't say it to comfort me. She said it the way you'd correct a man's arithmetic. Whatever story I was telling myself about who I was, the fact remained. The light went out and I called. She was not interested in my guilt. She was interested in the fact. And I understood, sitting on those steps in the gold light, that she had spent years being told her version of events was wrong, and that she had come out the other side of that with an absolute, unshakable commitment to naming things exactly as they were. It was the most beautiful thing about her. It still is. She kissed me in September. I want to be clear that she kissed me because I had made a decision months before that I was never going to be the one to move first. Not with her, not ever. And I had held to it so hard that I think I'd started to believe nothing would ever happen. We were in my kitchen. She'd stayed for dinner. She was drying a plate and she set it down and turned around and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. And then she crossed the kitchen and put her hand flat on my chest. I remember that. The flat of her hand, like she was checking whether I was really there, and she kissed me. And then she stepped back and looked at me with something like alarm. "Was that all right?" she asked. I couldn't speak. I nodded. She let out a breath she'd clearly been holding for a while, and she laughed shakily, and she said, "I've never done that before." "You've been married." "I've never done that before," she said again. And she held my eyes, and I understood exactly what she meant. And I had to look away for a second because of what came up in my throat. He came back one more time. It was October, almost a year to the day. She was staying over more nights than not by then, and she'd started keeping a coat on the hook by my door. And I had gotten used to the sound of another person in the house, which is a thing I didn't know I could get used to. It was after dark. I heard the truck. I knew that engine the way you know a sound that's been living in your worst hours. I got up. She had gone very white, but she stood up too, and I said, "Stay here." And she said, "No, just that. No." And she came out onto the porch with me. He was standing in my driveway. He'd walked from the road. He wasn't drunk, which somehow made it worse. He looked up at us on the porch, and his eyes went to her and stayed there. And he said her name in a voice that was trying so hard to be soft that it came out wrong. "Nora." She didn't move. He said, "I've been in a program." She didn't move. He said, "I'm different. Nora, look at me. I'm not who I was." And I stood there with my hand not quite touching her back, and I felt her breathing. And I understood that whatever happened in the next 30 seconds was not mine. It could not be mine. If I stepped in front of her, if I said the thing I wanted to say, if I did what every cell in my body was demanding I do, then I would be one more man deciding what happened to her in her own life. So I didn't move either, and Nora Whitaker stood on my porch in the cold, and she looked down at the man who had made her write a note 4 times before she could leave it. And she said in the steadiest voice I have ever heard from a human being, "I believe you." He took a step forward. "And I'm still not coming back." He stopped. "I hope it's true," she said. "I hope you're different. I hope you never do to anyone what you did to me. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's what I want." Her voice didn't rise. Not once. "But I'm not the person who has to find out whether it's real. I did my time finding out. Somebody else can go next, or nobody can. It's not going to be me." And then she said, "Please leave." And he stood there. And I have never in my life wanted to hit a man more than I wanted to hit him in that moment. And I have never been more certain that hitting him would have taken something away from her that she had just spent a year building. So I stood still. And after a long time, he turned around and he walked back down the driveway, and we heard the truck start, and we heard it go, and the sound of it faded down the county road until it was nothing at all. And then Nora sat down on the top step of my porch like her legs had stopped working. And I sat down next to her, and neither of us said anything. We just sat there. The wind came across the field. Somewhere down toward the creek, an owl started up. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We just sat there in the dark and listened to nothing happening. After a while, she leaned over and put her head on my shoulder, and I felt the exact moment the shaking stopped. We got married the following June in the field between the two houses. Not a big thing. Her sister came, and the man who owns the hardware store, and 4 guys from my road crew who I'd worked next to for 11 years and never once invited anywhere. Nora wore a dress she bought herself. She was very specific about that. She told me about 6 times in the weeks leading up to it, in a tone that dared me to have an opinion. I'm buying my own dress. And every time I said okay, and every time she looked at me for a second longer than the answer required, waiting for the catch. There wasn't one. There was never going to be one. She stopped waiting for it eventually. That took about 2 more years. Her old house stood empty across the field for a long time. Somebody finally bought it. A young couple, a school teacher, and a guy who fixes boat motors, who have no idea what happened in their kitchen and never will, because it isn't their weight to carry. Sometimes at night I look out the window and see their light on, and I feel something in my chest tighten and then let go. A light on in that house means somebody's just awake. That's all. That's all it means now. Nora manages the hardware store now. She hired 2 people last spring and fired one of them, and she came home that night and put her keys on the counter and said, "I hated that." And then after a second, "I'd do it again." She sleeps on the side of the bed nearest the door. I've never asked her to move. Some things you don't ask about. You just leave the space. And every so often, usually late, usually when the wind is coming down off the mountains and the house is making the sounds it makes, she'll go quiet in the middle of a sentence and I'll know where she's gone. And I'll just put my hand flat on her back and leave it there and not say a word. That's the whole technology. That's all it ever was. About a year ago, I was cleaning out a drawer in the kitchen and I found the note. I'd forgotten I asked for it back from the sheriff's office. It had been in an evidence bag, and the bag had a sticker on it with a case number, and inside was that soft gray square of paper with the careful, unsteady handwriting. "If the lights go out in my house tonight, call the police. Please don't knock. Don't come over, just call." Nora came in while I was standing there holding it. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she took it out of my hands, and she said, "Do you know what the hardest part of writing that was?" I said no. She said, "The word please." I looked at her. "I sat at that table for an hour," she said, "trying to figure out how to ask a stranger to save my life without being a burden about it." She was smiling when she said it. That's the thing that gets me. She was smiling, in our kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder. That's why it took 4 tries. I kept thinking I hadn't been polite enough. I didn't have anything to say to that. I never do about that. She folded the note back up along its old creases, and she handed it to me, and she said, "Keep it somewhere I don't have to look at it." So I did. It's in a box in the barn under the workbench, and I know exactly where it is, and I have not opened it since. But I think about it. I think about a woman sitting alone at a kitchen table with a man in the next room, trying to find a polite way to ask for her life. I think about how she folded it and walked out into the rain 4 separate times. And I think about myself, standing in a doorway with my hand on the knob and every good instinct I had screaming at me to run across that field and kick that door in and be a hero, and how the actual, unglamorous, correct thing to do was to stay exactly where I was and make a phone call and let her decide. Because that's what she asked for, not a rescue. She never once asked for a rescue. She asked for someone to do exactly the small thing she named, exactly the way she named it, and then to let her walk out of that house on her own 2 legs. And she did. She walked out on her own 2 legs. Every year on that night, the 11th of November, we don't do anything special. We don't market. We eat dinner and we do the dishes and we go to bed. But at about 11:20, wherever she is in the house, she'll find me. She doesn't say anything. She just comes and stands next to me for a minute. And then, at some point, one of us turns off the light. And that's the whole thing. That's the part nobody tells you about love, the real kind, the kind that comes out of a wreck. It isn't the grand rescue you imagine. It's just two people in a house choosing on purpose to let the light go out, and knowing, for the first time in either of their lives, that nothing bad is going to happen in the dark.